This chapter begins with a grounded, immediate observation that anchors the reader in place and time without embellishment, situating the scene near the boundary of the reserve and establishing the first visual cue, pressed grass where a group has passed, but now only one shape remains, which subtly hints at absence and separation. From the outset, the text adheres to a factual, matter-of-fact tone, identifying the cub's condition without metaphor or dramatization, his thin frame blending into pale grass, sides rising in shallow, uneven pulls that clearly indicate compromised breathing. By the second sentence, the reader understands that the subject is in critical condition, and that the situation is not one of rest, but of exhaustion. The absence of any sound or movement from the surrounding environment, no lioness calls, no pride in the heat haze, reinforces the isolation, while the heavy, dry air conveys the static, oppressive nature of the moment. Introducing Elias, the lead ranger, early on establishes the human anchor to this event, giving the reader a reliable point of perspective and signaling that decisions will soon follow. His slow, deliberate approach underlines a professional understanding of animal behavior. A cub, startled into running, may expend what little energy it has left, accelerating its decline. The careful study of the cub's body, dusty, flat fur clinging to ribs, an ear twitching weakly at a fly, a smear of dried mud along the flank, serves two purposes. It paints a medically relevant picture of malnutrition and fatigue, while also subtly evoking fragility. These are observations a field ranger would make, each detail carrying implications for the animal's health and survival. When Tarek, the second ranger, is introduced, the narrative gains a sense of procedure and thoroughness. While Elias assesses the cub, Tarek scans the surroundings for any trace of the pride. His sweep yields nothing, no movement, no sound, no scent, eliminating the possibility that the mother is nearby but hidden. This direct reporting of absence sets up the binary decision. If the mother is gone for hours, the cub will not survive. If the pride has been displaced or attacked, the cub is in immediate danger from predators or exposure. The narration reinforces this risk in plain language, avoiding abstraction. A young lion cannot last long without protection. The scene then tightens its focus as Elias closes the distance, lowering to one knee, a measured, non-threatening gesture. The cub reacts with quickened breathing and a faint rasp, lifting its head briefly before succumbing to fatigue again, which confirms both awareness and critical weakness. Elias speaks just 2 words, "Easy now," meeting the guideline that dialogue should be sparse, functional, and softly delivered. The appearance of the emergency satchel and the lifting wrap shifts the chapter from observation to action. The narrative makes clear that waiting risks the cub's life, but moving it carries its own uncertainties. The decision to act is framed as a necessity rather than a dramatic choice, maintaining the story's calm, documentary realism. The attempt of the cub to rise, legs trembling but failing, is the final observable sign that intervention is justified. Elias's slow, deliberate sliding of the fabric beneath the cub emphasizes both physical care and the fragility of the animal, his smooth handling avoiding unnecessary strain or shock. The cub's minimal reaction, brief tension, a soft huff, then settling, communicates exhaustion without anthropomorphizing. He is too weak to resist, but not oblivious. The stakes are restated explicitly after this contact. Moving him offers a chance at survival and possible reunion, while leaving him means almost certain death before nightfall. When Elias lifts the cub against his chest, the sensation of the rapid heartbeat through his forearm gives a tactile measure of the animal's condition, translating field observation into a human sensory experience without straying into sentimentality. The environment remains silent, an absence that underscores the urgency and finality of the decision. Tarek's continued scanning of the horizon maintains vigilance, showing that even after the immediate lift, The safety of the rescuers and the cub depends on constant awareness. The chapter closes with the slow walk toward the vehicle, the shimmer of heat obscuring what lies ahead, a factual detail that also functions as a natural visual curtain, ending the scene without forced drama. By concluding with, "For now, the cub was alive, and that was reason enough to keep moving," the narrative leaves the emotional weight in the survival of the present moment. Reflecting the reality of wildlife rescue, where outcomes are uncertain and each stage of intervention is measured against the simple fact of keeping an animal alive until the next step. Every element of the chapter is designed to move from discovery to decisive action, while maintaining the restrained, respectful tone of field observation, layering urgency not through heightened language but through repeated, plain-stated risk assessments and small, visible developments that carry real consequence. This approach ensures the reader feels the fragility of the cub's situation and the quiet resolve of the rangers without ever being pulled into melodrama, and it sets the stage for the following chapter's continuation of care, where the act of carrying the cub is not just physical transport, but a transitional phase between critical field rescue and the possibility of survival. This chapter opens exactly where the first left off, moving from the moment of decision to the act of physical rescue, and the narrative is built to maintain the same calm, grounded tone while increasing the level of human intervention. It begins with Elias making small, measured adjustments to his position, a detail that is important because it conveys his awareness that any sudden or rough movement could startle or injure the cub further. The description of the cub's head lolling slightly, its ears twitching once before becoming still, signals an animal on the edge of exhaustion but still minimally responsive, a realistic detail often seen in wildlife in the early stages of rescue. The environmental context is subtle but functional. The oppressive heat pressing down reminds us that conditions are actively working against the cub's survival and that each passing minute saps what little strength remains. Elias's hands sliding under the ribcage and hindquarters are described with medical precision, the kind of action a trained ranger or veterinarian would take to avoid strain on a compromised spine or limbs. The tactile observation, skin loose over bone, warmth thin and fleeting, is both a diagnostic cue and an emotional one, showing the animal's weakened state without anthropomorphizing it. When the cub is raised, the tremor through its limbs is a physical marker of effort beyond its capacity, and the accompanying rasp in its breath indicates not just weakness but possible dehydration or underlying illness. These small, physical signs are essential because they communicate stakes without exaggeration. They are the sort of details that a real ranger would notice and act upon. The cub, opening its eyes for only a moment, unfocused, further illustrates its vulnerability. Its tail twitching once before going still is another natural behavior that adds to the realism, not a sign of communication with the human, but rather an involuntary or instinctive reaction. The positioning of the forearm under the abdomen to keep the spine supported reflects true handling technique in field conditions, especially for young predators whose skeletal structure is still developing. The next sensory detail, the rapid, shallow flutter of the cub's heartbeat, delivers a clinical truth. Elevated heart rate in a resting animal signals stress, fear, or medical compromise. The narration explicitly states the core fact of the stakes here. A cub in this condition will not survive the night due to temperature drop and predator risk. This follows the story's established rule of restating risk in plain language, so the audience is reminded what is truly at stake. When Tarek steps closer, his behavior mirrors Elias's, scanning the environment, assessing the likelihood of the mother's presence. His low-spoken, "let's go," is not dramatized. It is a professional confirmation between two people who understand the implications of their actions. The text emphasizes the finality of the choice. Once the cub leaves this spot, the responsibility for its survival transfers entirely to the rangers. The balance of risks is laid out clearly. Carrying the cub away could mean separating it from its mother, but leaving it means near certain death from exposure or predation. The narrative does not attempt to make this sound heroic. It frames it as a necessary decision made under field realities. The scene then follows Elias as he takes the first deliberate step toward the path leading to the vehicle. The cub's head shifts against his arm, the muzzle brushing against his shirt, which is described not as a gesture of connection, but as a byproduct of being carried. The small exhalation from the cub's nostrils is framed as minimal resistance, another realistic behavioral note. The smoothness of Elias's pace is given weight because it serves a function, to prevent jarring the cub's fragile frame. His arms forming a cradle is not sentimental. It is structural support. Environmental detail shifts subtly here to mark the passage of time. The sun is lower, shadows are longer, and with that visual change comes the factual reminder that cooler temperatures are approaching. This matters because hypothermia risk increases for an underweight, weak animal as soon as heat dissipates from the ground. The narrative reinforces another risk assessment. Dehydration could make even rehydration dangerous if done too quickly, and any undetected injury could be worsened by movement. These details keep the tension realistic and fact-driven rather than emotional for its own sake. The choice of route, a narrow game trail, is functional, demonstrating fieldcraft. Tarek's role here is active, scanning for predator tracks or signs of threat, showing that even in the act of rescue, safety for both the rangers and the cub is maintained. Elias's attention is split between watching the path and monitoring the cub's condition in his arms. Breathing is still shallow but consistent, a small positive sign that is noted without overstating it. The wrap's edges are tucked to prevent slippage, a procedural detail that makes the handling credible and safe. As they near the vehicle, the lowering heat is acknowledged as both a relief and a warning. The relief is for the humans, but the warning is for the cub. Cooler air could quickly sap what little energy remains. The subtle tremor in the cub's hind legs and the flexing of claws into the fabric are again described as physical realities rather than emotional cues. The text labels them for what they are: signs of fatigue overtaking reflex, further proof that the rescue was necessary and the time margin was short. The visual of the vehicle glinting beyond the rise is understated, but marks progress toward immediate safety. When they reach it, the land remains silent and unchanged. No pride, no calls, no intervention from the wild. This absence carries weight because it confirms that no natural reunion was missed. Their choice to act stands uncontested by circumstance. Elias slows before reaching the truck, showing that even in urgency, the animal's stability and transport remains the top priority. The description of the day's light catching on the cub's ear is a brief, observational image, not symbolic, but it allows the audience to hold a clear picture of the animal's fragility in this moment. The final act of placing the cub in the shaded area of the vehicle is deliberate. Elias keeps his hand on the cub's side for a moment longer, monitoring the breath, shallow but still present. This is a procedural habit for a field rescuer, ensuring the animal has not deteriorated during handling. The closing line, "For now, that was enough reason to keep going," echoes the close of Chapter 1 in structure and tone, keeping the emotional impact restrained and factual. It does not declare victory or safety, because the stakes remain high. Instead, it frames survival in the present as the only guarantee they can claim, which is exactly how real-world rescue teams operate. Step by step, each moment of life preserved is a small, temporary success until the next phase of care is reached. By following this structure, the chapter moves decisively from discovery to active transport, showing that the narrative is progressing in meaningful, observable steps. It keeps the emotional core rooted in tactile, visual, and behavioral detail while maintaining a respectful distance from anthropomorphizing. The pacing ensures that the audience remains aware of the urgency without feeling manipulated, and the repeated, clear statements of risk maintain narrative integrity. Every description, from the cub's twitching ears to the wrap's tucked edges, serves a functional role, either in showing the animal's condition or in illustrating professional rescue conduct. This adherence to factual grounding makes the scene believable, emotionally resonant, and ready to transition naturally into the next chapter, where the focus will shift from the act of caring to the first stage of medical or observational care, and perhaps the first hints of whether the mother will be found in time. Elias settled under the low canopy of the acacia, its shadow stretching just far enough to shield them from the worst of the afternoon heat. The cub lay curled against his lap, the fragile rise and fall of its chest pressing lightly into the fabric of his trousers. Its breathing had steadied into a faint but more regular rhythm, though each draw of air still carried the sound of strain. Elias kept one palm resting along the cub's side, not gripping, only providing the quiet contact that seemed to keep the small body from shifting in distress. A few meters away, Tarek moved slowly through the thinning shade, his binoculars lifting at intervals as he scanned the distant grassland for movement. They were far enough from where the cub had been found to lessen the risk of attracting other predators, yet close enough that a returning mother might still follow her cub's scent to this place. The air beneath the tree was warm but still, carrying the faint dry scent of dust and leaves. Now and again, a fly settled briefly on the cub's ear before flicking away at the twitch of skin. Its tail, stretched loosely along Elias's thigh, stirred once before falling still again. The shade bought them time, but the balance remained delicate. The cub's body had little fat to insulate it when the temperature dropped, and every hour without food weakened its reserves. If the mother did not appear soon, they would have to decide whether to transport him farther, a choice that would reduce the chance of a natural reunion. From his position, Tarek adjusted to face a ridgeline to the east, where the glare made it hard to see beyond a few hundred meters. No silhouettes moved there, no familiar gait of a lioness cutting through the grass. Elias watched him pause, then resume his slow sweep toward the north. The quiet was unbroken except for the occasional rustle of dry pods falling from the branches above. The cub stirred once, shifting its head so the muzzle pressed against the inside of Elias's knee, its ears angling slightly as though catching some faint vibration in the air. Elias breathed steadily, keeping the rhythm even, letting the movement of his chest rise and fall under the cub's flank. A few minutes later, Tarek returned, crouching to speak low. "Nothing yet," he said, his eyes on the cub. "We'll give it a little longer." The words were not for reassurance, but as a marker of time, a signal that the window for passive waiting was narrowing. If they stayed too long and the mother did not come, darkness would bring more danger. If they left too soon, they might separate a living cub from a searching parent. The decision would hinge on the next movements they saw in the grasslands around them. The cub shifted again, this time stretching its front legs partway before settling back down. The movement was slow, almost drowsy, but it showed a trace of energy not present earlier. Elias reached for the small canteen in his pack, careful not to jar the cub as he unscrewed the lid. A shallow capful of water glinted briefly before he lowered it toward the muzzle. The cub's nostrils flared, tongue flicking once to taste before lapping twice, each motion deliberate and slow. Elias did not press for more. Too much too quickly could do harm. He waited until the cub withdrew its head and settled again. That small drink, though modest, was a sign it still had the strength to respond. The sun's angle shifted, light filtering differently through the branches above. Shadows stretched farther across the dry soil, warning them of the slow approach of evening. Tarek stepped back to the edge of the clearing to resume his watch, while Elias adjusted his seated position to keep the cub fully in shade. Around them, the land kept its silence, a silence that could mean safety or could mean the absence of any pride nearby. For now, the cub's breathing stayed steady, its body warm against Elias's legs, and that warmth was the only thing standing between it and the dangers waiting beyond the acacia's reach. The first sign was not movement, but the faint shift of light against the far edge of the clearing. Between the pale stems of dry grass, a shape began to separate from the horizon, broad-shouldered and low to the ground. The lioness stood half in shadow, her head lifted, ears pricked forward, and her body held in the rigid stillness of an animal weighing the scene before her. Even from the distance, the lines of her flanks rose and fell with steady control, her tail hanging loose but motionless. Elias felt the change before he spoke. The air between them seemed to narrow, the moment stretching into a quiet that was no longer empty but charged with the weight of her attention. He let his shoulders soften, his breathing stay even, and his posture fixed in the same measured calm he had held for the last hour. The cub lay against his lap in the shade, its ears shifting minutely as if registering some sound Elias could not hear. The small body was warmer now, though still light and fragile in his hands, its breaths soft and even. He knew the lioness could see it, could see him, and that she was reading every stillness, every motion, with the instinct of a mother assessing threat. A single step forward or any abrupt change could turn her caution into retreat, or worse, into a rush that might harm the cub in her urgency. The stakes were exact and immediate. If she accepted their presence, there was a path to return the cub safely. If she judged them a danger, she would vanish into the grass, and the chance of reunion could close for good. Tarek had stilled too, binoculars lowered now, his eyes on the lioness. The open stretch between her and the acacia where they sat was broken only by a few low shrubs, not enough to hide movement but enough to offer her cover if she chose to circle. Her gaze did not waver. The distance was far enough to hold a measure of safety, close enough that each side could study the other without doubt. Elias let the cub's weight rest fully in his lap, shifting only enough to ensure its head was clear and visible. The cub stirred faintly, a soft sound leaving its throat. Not loud, but carrying in the flat air between them. The lioness's ears twitched at the sound, her body leaning forward just slightly. The movement was so controlled it barely disturbed the grass at her chest. She did not lower her head, nor did she step in. The stillness felt deliberate, a testing of the space. Elias kept his eyes on her without fixing them. His chin slightly dipped, his body language neither claiming nor yielding the ground. The cub shifted again, one paw flexing slowly against his leg, the small claws brushing the fabric without catching. Tarek took a slow step to the side, widening the angle between them, careful to keep his arms low and his posture non-confrontational. The sun caught on the lioness's shoulder as she shifted her weight, muscles drawing tight beneath the tawny hide. Elias knew the margin of error here was slim. If she perceived pursuit, she could flee beyond their ability to track. If she perceived challenge, she might charge before the cub could be set down. Neither outcome would bring the reunion they needed. The cub's head lifted slightly now, its nostrils flaring, and for the first time since they had found him, his eyes opened wider, fixing on something past the shade. The faintest whiff of air came from his nose, and Elias felt a minute change in the way the small body rested against him. The mother remained still, but her tail moved once, a slow, sweeping curve behind her. Elias did not speak, only let his breathing continue its steady rhythm. The open ground between them seemed to wait, holding its shape, as the late light warmed the edges of the grass and the distance narrowed in more than just space. The lioness began to move with the kind of patience born from long survival, shifting her weight from one forepaw to the other, letting each step settle before taking the next. Elias stayed as he was, shoulders loose, breathing steady, the cub still resting in the fold of his lap. The small body stirred, a ripple through the ribs and flank, and then a soft, thin cry carried across the open grass. The sound reached her and drew her forward by another careful stride. Her ears tipped forward, then back, then forward again, testing every shift in scent and sound. Tarek adjusted his position with slow, measured steps, widening the space between himself and Elias so the lioness could see a direct, unbroken line to her cub. If she sensed pursuit, she would flee beyond reach. If she felt challenged, she might charge. If she read calm, she could choose to come closer. The risk remained sharp and simple. A wrong movement now would end the chance of reunion, and every passing minute would drain more of the cub's strength. Elias shifted from sitting cross-legged to resting on one knee, letting the cub be seen without obstruction. He let his hand slide under the wrap, ready to lower the cub to the ground the moment she came near enough. "It's okay, girl," he murmured, the words quiet, almost part of his breath, meant only to hold his own pace steady. The lioness took another step. Dust lifted briefly around her ankle, then fell. Her gaze never left the cub. She angled herself so that a low shrub passed between her and Tarek before straightening again, her muzzle raised to sweep the air. The cub answered with another thin note, then fell still, the effort seeming to take all he had left. If he tried to stand now, his legs might fail. If he lay too long, the cooling air could sap the last of his energy. The gap closed by a few more meters. Elias eased the cub down onto the shaded soil, keeping the wrap beneath him so the ground felt soft. His hands stayed open and still at the cub's sides, showing no hold. The lioness dropped her head slightly, inhaling once, twice as if confirming what her eyes had already told her. Tarek stilled completely, his binoculars hanging loose, his posture no more imposing than the trunk of the tree above them. The terms of the moment were clear. If they forced her decision, she could run and take the search into night. If they blocked her path, she might panic and harm the cub. If they remained still, the choice stayed with her. She crossed the last distance until she was within reach of Elias's knee, ears tipped forward, her whiskers moving the air above the cub's back. Elias lowered his head a fraction, his palms pressed flat into the soil. The cub lifted his muzzle, eyes barely open, and released a faint whiff of air. The lioness breathed in and touched her nose to his flank, holding the contact long enough for the cub to twitch once and relax. Elias drew his hands back slowly, 1 inch, then another. If she took him now, the bond could reclose. If she turned away, they would have to carry him out and attempt again elsewhere before night fell. She lifted her head once toward Elias, then returned her focus to the cub. Her tail moved in a slow, even arc. Without rushing, she stepped over his hands, her body casting shade across the small form. Elias eased back onto his heels, the air moving faintly under the tree and bringing with it the dry scent of grass seed. The lioness parted her jaws, found the scruff with delicate precision, and took it in her mouth without pressure. The cub made a small sound, not of protest but of recognition, and the grass bent lightly under her weight as the space between them disappeared. The lioness held her position for a moment longer, the muscles along her shoulders shifting with each measured breath. Then she lowered her head, her muzzle brushing the cub's flank in a touch so light it barely disturbed the dust along his coat. Her eyes never left Elias, steady and unblinking, weighing his stillness as much as she marked her cub's scent. Elias kept his hands pressed to the ground, knees bent, his posture unchanged except for the soft release of air from his lungs. There was no sound from her throat, no growl to warn him back, and no backward step to reclaim more space. The quiet was its own decision. The cub gave a faint, rasping exhale, shifting under her touch as though pulled by the familiarity in her presence. His tail twitched once, then lay flat again. The risk here was precise. If she broke away now, the cub might lose his last chance of being carried back to the safety of the pride. If she lashed out in defense, his weakened body could not withstand the impact. Tarek stood off to the side, weight balanced evenly, his eyes moving between the lioness and the line of grass beyond. The open space around them felt thinner now, the distance between predator and human closed by choice rather than by accident. Elias allowed his gaze to drop fractionally, never fixing on hers, a signal of non-confrontation. The lioness breathed in once more over the cub, her whiskers stirring the fur along his spine, then eased her muzzle forward to the loose skin at the back of his neck. Her jaw opened only as far as it needed to, teeth folding gently around the scruff without piercing. The cub's front legs tucked slightly, his weight shifting into her grasp, but he made no sound beyond a small puff of breath. She lifted her head slowly, adjusting her stance so the cub's body cleared the ground. Each step she took backward was deliberate, placing her paws in the same spots she had used before. Elias remained where he was, the warmth of the cub's absence still faint against his knees, resisting the urge to track her with his head. If she sensed pursuit, she might drop him. If she felt the space respected, she might carry him the full distance. The cub's hind legs dangled limply beneath her, swaying with the rhythm of her walk, but there was no sign of distress, only the heavy surrender of exhaustion. When she reached the margin of the clearing, she stopped and glanced back once. Her eyes held no change in shape or movement from before, but the pause was enough to register acknowledgement. Then she turned, the grass parting around her as she moved into its cover. The cub's small form vanishing with her. The sound of her passage faded quickly, absorbed into the wider hush of the late afternoon. Elias stayed crouched for another few breaths, the faint scent of her still drifting in the air. The space she had occupied remained empty now, the only movement coming from the slow sway of the grass she had disturbed. Somewhere beyond that shifting line, the cub was being carried home, and the clearing settled back into its stillness. The lioness adjusted her grip on the cub's scruff, her jaws closing with the careful precision of an animal accustomed to carrying fragile life. The cub hung loosely, his limbs swaying with each subtle shift of her balance, his eyes half closed in the slack posture of exhaustion. She stepped forward, muscles rolling beneath her tawny coat, each movement measured so the cub's body did not jolt against her chest. Elias remained motionless in the shade. His gaze lowered just enough to keep from meeting hers directly, his body language steady and unthreatening. The ground between them was already closing, not in distance but in the quiet acknowledgement that the transfer was complete. The risks had shifted now. Her choice to take him meant his survival depended entirely on her ability to return him to safety without interruption. If she dropped him too soon, or if another predator crossed her path, the chance of reunion with the pride could vanish. She moved through the clearing at a pace that was neither hurried nor slow, the grass brushing against her legs and parting in gentle arcs. Her tail trailed low, its tip twitching once before falling still again. When she reached the edge where the open ground met the tall grass, she stopped, lifting her head slightly so her gaze swept the space behind her. The pause was brief, but in it she turned just enough to glance back toward Elias. Her eyes lingered for only a moment, unreadable in their intent, before she angled her body away and stepped into the cover. Tarek did not move, his hands resting loosely at his sides, his weight shifted into a patient stance. The air carried no sound but the faint rustle of her passage. The cub's dangling paws disappeared first into the grass, followed by the line of her spine and the sway of her shoulders. Elias kept his position, counting the seconds until even the movement of the taller stems faded into stillness. Somewhere ahead, she would need to cross ground where the pride could scent her and hear the cub's cry. The effort of carrying him would demand more from her than a normal patrol, but leaving him behind would have cost him the night. The calculation was simple. Every step she took without stopping was one step closer to his survival. For a few moments longer, the grass swayed in the direction of her travel, the faintest trail of movement marking the path she had taken. Then even that settled, the land reclaiming its stillness. The scent of her lingered on the air, mixing with the dry heat and the faint dust kicked up by her paws. Elias let out a slow breath, not of relief, but of recognition that his part in the moment was over. He and Tarek remained in the shade, their eyes scanning the horizon not for her return, but for the signs that the territory was settling again. The sun leaned lower toward the western edge of the sky, and the first coolness of evening began to gather in the open spaces, carrying with it the long shadows of the acacia branches. Somewhere beyond sight, a cub was being carried home, his small weight swinging gently in the grip that had once brought him into the world. The sound came first, a low, rhythmic tread in the grass, too measured to be the wind. Elias lifted his head slightly, eyes scanning the space where the lioness had vanished. The stems parted, and she stepped back into view, her body low but purposeful. In her jaws hung the limp form of a freshly killed hare, its fur still marked by the clean puncture of her bite. She carried it without hurry, each step deliberate, her gaze fixed ahead. The air around her felt different now, no longer taut with the wariness of moments before, but holding something quieter, almost resolved. She reached the shaded ground where Elias remained seated and lowered the hare onto the soil between them. The kill landed softly, its weight barely disturbing the dust. Her head remained lowered for a moment longer before she straightened, her eyes meeting his without challenge, without fear. Elias did not move to touch the offering. He kept his posture the same, hands resting on his knees, letting her set the terms of this brief return. This was not a warning, nor an act of intimidation. There was no tension in her stance, no flattening of the ears, and no deep rumble from her chest. It was instead a gesture rooted in the quiet logic of her world, a recognition perhaps of his role in returning her cub to her, or simply an instinctive exchange in the language of survival. The hare lay between them as proof that the moment they had shared was not only tolerated, but acknowledged. The risks had passed for now. Her cub was safe in the tall grass behind her, hidden from view but near enough that she could hear him if he called. She lingered for only a few breaths more, her tail swaying once in the still air. The sun had shifted lower, its light thinning into the long gold of late afternoon, casting her outline in warm shadow. Without sound or sudden motion, she turned and stepped back toward the grass, her paws pressing silent prints into the dry earth. Each movement was fluid, her body sliding between the stalks until only the ripple of grass marked her path. In seconds, even that movement stilled, and the clearing returned to its earlier hush. Elias's gaze dropped once to the hare, its body cooling quickly in the shade. This was not food for him, nor a trade, but a message left in the only currency the lioness understood. It was a closing of the space between their worlds, however briefly, before each returned to the lives they were bound to. The air held her scent for a little while longer, mingling with the faint metallic tang of the kill before both began to fade. Beyond the clearing, the grass swayed gently under the growing weight of evening, and somewhere within it, a cub rested in the safety of his mother's presence. The wind moved softly through the acacia branches above, carrying the day toward its quiet end.